What we are going to be looking at is the strange new world. For some of you, very familiar, so familiar that nothing is new. For some of you listening to this, going, where am I? Am I living in the same world as those people around me? So open the booklet and you'll see I've got a set of quotations for you there. I haven't actually investigated the booklet myself, but I am going to take it on confidence that it is exactly as we set it out. Yeah, that looks great. And I want to just read these quotations. The reason why I put all the quotations in, I may not read all of them as we go through it, but I gave them to you so because I like this way of approaching the subject, because there's always more in a quotation than what I can say. For the reader, there's something to go back and reflect upon, but it also sets the agenda of what we're doing. And so the first quote is from a chap called N.S. Lyons. It's not his real name. That was his pen name when he wrote this on a Substack years ago. And I used this quotation in 2022. I was asked to do a keynote address to theological educators in South Africa about how to negotiate the future. And I gave a paper on a theology to die for. And that's really what I'm going to, in most simple terms, that's really what I'm advocating for us today. That the theology we hold is worth dying for. Okay. And he wrote this in note in April 2021. Friends, this is a year before Russia invaded the Ukraine. He wrote these words. He said, "We are living through an era of epochal change. At few times in history have so many currents of civilizational transformation coalesced and crashed into us at once, and at such speed. To say that we are being unmoored by massive technological, economic, environmental, geopolitical, and socio-cultural shifts would be to insufficiently limit our description of what is occurring. In our bones, many of us can feel the rumbling of the earthquake and intuit the terrible truth. We are experiencing a tectonic upheaval, a rending, uprooting, cataclysmic shift from one era of history to another. And in such times there will inevitably be blood." Do you feel it? Powerful. So many good words in such a short paragraph. I'm so jealous. It's so good. And then a quote by Sharon James, who wrote a wonderful little booklet. If you can get your book, you can get your hand on it, on Apologetics. She said, "Ideas have consequences, their outworking can be murderous." And she looks particularly at the ideas of the modern man and what has come about and how that has been murderous. And then a quote from 1942, C.S. Lewis. He says, "You and I have need of the strongest spell that can be found to wake us from the evil enchantment of worldliness which has been laid upon us for nearly 100 years. Almost our whole education has been directed to silencing this shy, persistent inner voice of responding to or hearkening to God. We are under a spell," he says. And then a quote, 1974, by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the day that he was arrested. He wrote a very short essay. You can find these online, by the way, friends. They're really worth reading. He says, "Oppression demands of us only submission to lies, a daily participation in deceit, and this suffices as our fealty, our subservience. Never knowingly support lies." Okay. So Simon gave us a good introduction, but these quotes will lead you down that way too. So what I'm going to do this morning is three things. We're going to reconsider the word apologetics, apologia, as it is in the New Testament. I'm going to try and sketch a bit of scenario of the times that we live in, and then I'm going to try and offer some ways of how to negotiate that space. Let me just say that I'm not very good at teaching people skills, okay? But I think what we need before we learn skills is to get something of the passion of what is necessary that we need to have in order to get to the motivation of gathering skills, okay? So I think that's important, and that's probably more of what I'm going to do today. Okay, point one, apologia, its meaning, that's the Greek word. The classical location of that text, of that word, is of course in 1 Peter 3:15. I'll just read it. "But in your heart set apart Christ as Lord, being ready at all times to make a defense, there's our word, to all who ask you for a word concerning the hope that is in you, but with gentleness and respect. If you're familiar with 1 Peter, the context is that of innocent suffering. 1 Peter sort of rests on top of Isaiah 53. Wonderful, remarkable New Testament letter. And so this word of apologetics, that we get apologetics from, occurs in a letter which is that kind of letter. And the word apologia, I like to define it more, I think a better word than defense is to be able to speak to something, to be able to offer a word. Let me say this. Often in with my children, we will be in a situation where there's been a transgression, and I will say, okay, let me just explain to you these things, this and this and this and this, do you understand? And then I always expect silence, silent submission. But I never get it. I always get a child that will say, can I say something? In my own defense. Okay, can I speak to, this situation? I absolutely love it when my children do that. I'm so grateful they do. And that they have the confidence and the freedom to do that. Now, in the New Testament, I've listed to you all the verses where that word occurs in the Greek. And if you go look at them, you'll see they're all related to life and commitment to Jesus, to faith, and where faith has taken people, and often they're associated innocence in relation to a charge against them. In classical literature, of course, it comes up in the Greek literature, particularly at Socrates' trial, and in Christian theology, through the centuries, not initially, but later became something of an intellectual enterprise, a professional discipline. So apologetics is now actually a subject in a university curriculum, and very, very, very eloquent. The best Christian minds have spoken and written in the domain of apologetics. For a large part of this audience, the most important apologetical works are not the contemporary ones, or the Enlightenment ones, or the post-Reformational ones. The key apologetical works were written in the early centuries by African theologians, and sets the tone for all of Christian theology. Most of the debates that we're dealing with today actually occur in the early centuries. That is something that never goes, no one ever says that, but that needs to be said. Okay, did you hear that? Okay, we'll say that again at another point. So I want to slightly redefine apologia, as I already said in that introduction with Simon. I see it more as a confession of faith than winning an argument. And I remember doing apologetics with Alistair McGrath at Regent College in Canada, and he made that statement in the class. He said, this is about building bridges. In fact, that's the title of his apologetics work. And I thought, oh, what a weenie. He can't argue. He really, really can. But he was right, in the sense that it's more about confessing our faith with gentleness and respect than winning the argument. So it's not just an exercise in logic and rhetoric. So it's not just for great minds. It's for every Christian. I've already said that. The question in John 18, what is truth, is a fascinating question, because it looks philosophical, and there may be philosophical undercurrents in the life of Pilate, this contested man. But you have to know that it is a what question with a who answer. And apologetics is always about Jesus, Christian apologetics. It's never not about Jesus. If there's no Jesus in it, it is not apologetics, friends. And there's a lot of that out there. The world powers are colluding. The political power and the spiritual power, the kingdoms of the world are colluding against the kingdom of God in Christ. And Christ is right at the crossroads there, and he still is today. And so apologetics, friends, is not only personal, it is actually extremely powerful and public, as that quotation from 1 Corinthians 2 makes so clear. Look at what Paul says, my words and my speech were not in persuasive words of wisdom. Of course, he's writing to this Corinthian church where philosophy trumps everything. But then he goes on to say it's in the demonstration of the Spirit and of power. If you do some New Testament exegesis, you'll find that that word demonstration is a very unique word, taken from the Greek world of philosophy, actually, ironically so, but to bring about conviction. And that's what Paul is on about, so that your faith should not rest on the wisdom of men, but on the power of God. That needs to be said. It's very important, apologetics. Then he goes on to say, very interestingly, yet we do speak wisdom. And Paul, as a master speaker, rhetorician, however you say that word, is very much up for the task, as all of you have known who've traveled through Romans. And he says, we do speak wisdom, which none of the rulers of this age had understood. For if they had understood it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. How true is that statement? So apologetics is always, inevitably, public. Because Jesus, it is the fact of the coming of Jesus. It is the public execution of Jesus that is at the core, at the center of our faith. And so there's no such thing as private apologetics or private witnessing. Christianity is inevitably public. It will always be public, no matter how much you shy away from. But what it really boils down to one thing, and that is what it is clearly stated in Revelation 1, it is to bear witness. John says, I bear witness, martus, to the testimony, the witness of Jesus, who is the faithful witness. And from that Greek word, eventually we come to the word in English that we have today, to be a martyr. Okay? It is because of our witnessing that some of us, maybe even some of you, how do we know what the future holds? We'll have to speak that word of truth and pay the ultimate price and become a martyr. So it is because of your witness, your apologia to the Jesus, the Lord of glory, who has saved you, which may take you in that direction. Okay, so my first point is very simple. Don't think of apologetics merely as an intellectual enterprise. Some of you are very brainy. I know that some of you are super smart, sitting here this morning, and you go like, okay, right, give me that stuff. Right, let me go out there, load my machine gun full of good theological truths. It is primarily bearing testimony to Jesus and faith in him. It is also a spiritual enterprise, because when the fool says in his heart there is no God, there is no intellectual persuasion that will change that. Okay, and we know that these are spiritual things. Okay, let's come to apologetics in a culture of deceit, and I added there, and despair. Reading from the top, that quotation that I put together, living at the unquiet frontiers of modernity. Now, I'm going to be throwing lots of words at you. Don't panic. Don't take fright. Don't think you need to know all these things. You're in it. I'm just going to give words to the things that you are already experiencing. Okay, there's nothing new here, but there's new words for things that you haven't had a word for, that I hopefully am going to introduce. So this is a quote, a little phrase by Charles Taylor, who's a Canadian philosopher. He's still alive, and he's probably the preeminent Christian philosopher of our age, of our time. And he wrote a book, a magisterial book called Our Secular Age, for those of you who have spare time and read books and not just scroll on your phone. Okay, he says, living at the unquiet frontiers of modernity, the deep longings of the heart occasionally come to the surface. During such times of cultural unrest or inner unrest, our apologetics will turn out to be less like winning an argument and more like breaking a spell. And that's Ortland's little sentence. So what I'm going to argue basically is that we are living under a spell. Some of you may wake up, many of you won't. And that's the hard thing about telling people they live under a spell. I keep on telling my children, social media has cast a spell over your lives, and they just do not agree with me. And yet I can see it, clear as day. I can see the behavior change the moment that smartphone comes along. In other words, we live in a time when things are pretty crazy. where people will tell you that, you know, black is white and white is black. They will actually subvert the most basic concepts of truth. A friend of mine sent me a video that I watched last night of a woman in Australia who's been taken to court by the Human Rights Commission. She runs an app for women, and a man laid a charge against her, a man who claims to be a woman, laid a charge against her for blocking him, for not allowing him in. And she's been fighting that case for 4 years with the Human Rights Commission, and it's clear as day for any 10-year-old to know what's going on there, but it's cost her $1 million so far. And so when you hear that kind of thing, you go nuts, and you go like, how did this happen? In what world do we live? And yet, friends, people have been saying this for a very long time. G.K. Chesterton, those of you who've read Chesterton, in 1905, in the book Heretics, he says, fires will be kindled to testify that 2 and 2 make 4. He says, swords will be drawn to prove that leaves are green in summer. Now, you can go Google that, and it's a lovely long quotation of the world that we've entered in. So, the key thing we need to do, friends, then, is to define reality. That's the first act a leader does. If you're a leader, you define reality. If you can't define reality, you can't lead, nor can you lead yourself. Or, to state it in worldview categories, where are we in the human drama? Where are we in the story? How did we get here? And are we under a spell? And it's very interesting. One of the students that I work with told me this week that she's come to Christ, and she's also recently learned from the early chapters of Genesis that after the flood, there's a bow and there's a rainbow in the sky, which actually signifies God hanging up his bow. God is no more pulling his bow, he's hanging it up. That might be news for some of you as well. And she walked out with her sister who is gender dysphoric, let's use that terminology, and she said, seeing the rainbow and wanting to have an opportunity to explain this beautiful covenant of peace that God reinstates with Noah along the progress of redemption. And she says, look at the rainbow. And her sister looked up and said, oh, the LGBTQ sign. Amazing. You know, I didn't know that's where it came from. So the rainbow was revelational, but depending on with which eyes you see it. My daughter was telling me yesterday about this podcast, some of you may know it, of these 2 nuns who had chat together and worked together, and it's this wonderful, positive podcast of 2 Christians collaborating with each other, and 90% of the comments are, see how wonderful humanity can get along if you take the man out the way. So do you see what kind of culture we live in? Now, the problem with the church is that privately we live in that culture, and that culture has infiltrated the church, yet we kind of pretend and live as if we're 20 years behind this curve, and yet it's all around us. So if you go out here and you chat to your buddies out there, you'll know that this is what's happening. When you're in here in the church, we all pretend we're still Christian, you know, but the world has changed. And so I throw these words at you: a convulsive space, politically and geographically, an apocalyptic era. We are most decidedly in an apocalyptic age, friends. An apocalypse doesn't mean the end of the world, but it might. Okay? So apocalypse literally means to be unveiled, to be revealed. You know, things are being unveiled before you through all the alternative sources of media that we've never had before. That the world has changed, and some people have been lying about some things for an awfully long time. And since COVID, that's a good historical benchmark, things have radically changed in the world. We have most decidedly entered into an apocalyptic age. Where that leads us, I don't know, but that's where we are. And we properly inhabit the secular age, okay? Even in Africa. Now, I'll try and address some African issues, and if you have particular African questions for our Q&A, I'd be very keen to entertain them and speak to them. Anything that really bothers you. But this secular age has infiltrated our African space, and we do need to talk about that, okay? And so I give you a whole lot of terms there, a whole list of them, and I'm going to define just 3 of them for you, and you'll be able to Google it. AI will help you to find an answer if you just Google it. Okay. So what is a secular age? And if you are familiar with Charles Taylor's work, you know that he defines secular in 3 different ways, and I'm not going to speak to that, but this particular definition of a secular age is perhaps not what you think it is. A secular age is defined more or less by Charles Taylor as a time when belief in God, that's both theism and deism, if you can distinguish between the two, is no longer the default or the only option, but only one of many possibilities individuals can embrace. In fact, a secular age would say you must embrace an option. Okay? It's really good. It's good for you to be spiritual. Don't be religious, but be spiritual of some kind or another. And so what it really represents is a paradigm shift in culture. Many of you here are old enough to have experienced that sort of earthquake, and you know what life was like before the flood. Thinking about the rains this week. And what did the river look like before the flood came down? Well, it doesn't look the same now, okay? And some of you will know what that's like. It is now possible to live as if God does not exist, where previously it was really hard to do so. And in practice, it translates into a disconcerting incuriosity towards the gospel. Now, that's maybe a word you haven't heard before. But previously, where people would be curious about God, you're increasingly finding people being incurious about God. Now, you say, not in Africa. I'm afraid so. Okay. But in the West, most certainly. And its main form of expression is exactly that word, expressive individualism. Now, that's a very important word. People use different words for it, but that's actually a very important term to help us understand what people are like. And expressive individualism basically suggests that each one of us, as an individual, have our own ways of expressing our humanity and who we deeply are within. But not only do we have that privately, we must express it outwardly. So what is inside must be expressed outside. So if you have maybe some thoughts that you yourself, I had a thought that maybe I should qualify that thought. Okay, maybe I should be careful about those thoughts. Expressive individualism saying, no, those thoughts are your thoughts. They must be expressed. Okay, you can imagine where that goes. For example, the debate around pronouns that catapulted Jordan Peterson into fame in Canada while we were there. We lived in Canada at the time. And he fought for that. He said to you, you can't just choose your own pronoun because psychologically and scientifically, your definition of yourself is not just what you have something internally, it's also provided by the society around you and an absolutely necessary construction. Okay? You are not just who you think you are, you're also, in a sense, what other people think you are and speak to you in your life as to what you're like. Imagine making wise decisions without the input of others. Dreadful. And Peterson lost that debate. And we have this glorious little thing of my pronouns are so and so. And then you've got someone like Doug Wilson, controversial pastor, who says, my pronouns are he and her, which is pretty good. I'll tip my hat to that one. But this culture, of course, has infiltrated the church. Okay? And it's inside more than it is outside. Os Guinness wrote The Gravedigger Files, which is actually from a quote by Nietzsche, but basically saying that while the church is fighting a battle out there, it's losing the battle inside. I was rudely awakened a few weeks ago when my 16-year-old started talking to me about feminism in a manner and degree that I did not expect from a 16-year-old. And I was like, oh boy, I'm in deep trouble. We live in a Christian household. How did this debate just land in my lap like this? I was not ready for it. So it's everywhere, friends. Culture is what the fish swims in. It's the water we all swim in. And there's no church door strong enough to prevent the water from flowing in. It'll come in. And the great problem with apologetics in the church is that apologetics must be done within the church. If we cannot offer a defense against the cultural onslaught around us within the church to our own people, why should we bother doing it out there? Okay. So this is actually a critical debate. We often have groups of students in our home, and my kids are students as well, and they brought over a group of friends, and they're in one of those, let's call them acrobatic churches, extremely acrobatic churches. And and just lovely people. And I was having a little bit of a debate with one of my daughter's friends, and I was trying to tell her that in our day, and I was in university ministry, we fought for truth. And she's like just nodding her head. And eventually I said to her, you know, Abby, the problem with you guys is you just go to church for therapy. We used to go to church for truth. And she looked at me and she thought and she paused and she said, yes. That was not the response I was hoping for. She thought that was great. Therapy is what we need. That's what the church is for. Now, of course, therapy is necessary. But we need truth as well. I think it was Ben Shapiro who said, facts don't care about your feelings. I'm not a Ben Shapiro fan necessarily, but that's a great statement. Okay. So the third concept I think you need to know and take on board is this concept of a social imaginary. And it's a big word, but it basically means what society has become, how we define reality around us. So if you can imagine that you define individual reality from who you are on the inside, and one of the shocking examples, of course, is I am a woman trapped in a man's body or something like that, and I'll speak to that in a moment. You can imagine that a social if you put a whole lot of people together, the social imaginary is not a worked out philosophical or intellectual definition of what kind of world you live in, but it's a world that you've patched together through images, through culture, through media, so all the things that make up this postmodern life. Then you put together, and that becomes the space within which you live. And it becomes the space within which all of us inescapably live because of the power of social media. If you consider that Africa has the greatest uptake of cell phone and internet users in the world, do you think that Africans are going to escape the machinations of the TikTok enterprise? Okay, not a chance. Okay, so there's no escape from this stuff, unfortunately. So we do indeed live in a strange new world. If you want to know the meaning of any of the other terms that I didn't address, you can ask me afterwards. So how did we get here? That's a key question. And let me speak to that very briefly. I mentioned the title of Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. I tried to persuade my daughter on the way to Cape Town. She's rock climbing today. I tried to persuade her that she really ought to read this book. I'm going to try and persuade you to read that book as well. Because for one thing, what that book will do is enable you to understand how we got to where we got to today. And you don't have to understand, you don't have to know everything, but the narrative of it is quite phenomenal. So in that book, Carl Trueman sets the question in the introduction by asking how the statement, I am a woman trapped inside a man's body, changed from being incomprehensible 20 years ago to being incontestable today. Okay? How did we go from incomprehensible to incontestable without any debatable? That's the question. And so this thing has come at us like a juggernaut, right? It's come like a snowball at us culturally. And most of us don't even know what we've been hit with at this stage. We've been caught in an avalanche, and we are just gasping for air, okay? And it's a dreadful thing, and it's happened so quickly. And Trueman says in order to address this question, you first have to ask another question. And this, I think, is key. He says, what are the cultural conditions under which such a question is incontestable? He says, in others, what does society have to assume to be true in order for that statement to make any sense. And the basic assumption is, and you follow the argument of the book, and I'm not going to rehash it for you in any way, but if we've moved over a couple of centuries to defining a human being most fundamentally on internal categories of feeling and tuition only, we can objectively say that is true if subjectively that is our experience. Okay? And that is massively problematical. But if you read that book, it'll actually give you a lot of confidence, I think, in speaking to this kind of issue. Now, Africa has its own apologetical issues and its own particular issues that it wrestles with, from identity to race to colonialism and so on, and maybe we can address a few of those in a moment. But there is a bit of an overlap. There is an agreement with a Western counterpart, sadly so, and please ask me questions about this. I think the fundamental thing for us as Christians is to know that the devil is a deceiver, that he is the father of lies. If you embrace the kind of Christianity where you don't every now and then speak to someone and say, I feel we're a little bit under attack here. Have you said that? I feel that we have some opposition here. What do we do? If you haven't come to that point, you're not living within the biblical world. There is an enemy. He's an opposer, and he's a liar. He's a deceiver. And yes, he has cast the world under a spell. And we live at the climax of a spell that has come a long, long way. And no, Donald Trump did not heal it or fix it. Sadly, everyone hoped he would. Richard also quoted 2 Corinthians 4 verse 4, in whose case the God of this world, of this age, has blinded the minds of the unbelieving, that they may not see the light of the gospel or the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. So the world is under a spell. And many of our people, of our children, of our community, equally have come under a spell. Okay. All right. So truth and lies in a post-truth age. How am I doing for time? Till 15:15, Simon? Okay. All right. I'm going to have to move on here a little bit. So we're going to have to shove some of the stuff into the question time. So if there's some things that I don't make clear to you in the booklet, please ask. In 2016, the word of the year was post-truth, and the Oxford Dictionary defines it as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. So it's not just us Christians that are concerned about this. Everyone is recognizing for quite some time that the world is in a post-truth age, and it's everywhere. And it creates unique challenges to apologetics. And I've got a set of questions here, which are the kind of questions that we've never had to ask before, and I'm going to leave them for afterwards. I want to make you alert to the 4 manifestations or expressions of this culture of deceit. Otherwise, you don't get your money's worth this morning, because that's the title, after all. And the first untruth is subjective untruth. And I've already spoken to that, and so I don't need to say any more. Narrative untruth we've actually already addressed as well, in terms of the social imaginary. And the narrative truth is, or social imaginary, the narrative untruth, is really that we have chosen to live in a world that actually have this kind of furniture. This is how we furnish the house which we live in. And these are our choices, okay? And these are then the algorithms that continue to feed us once we've made those choices. Do you understand that you are in an echo chamber when you've entered into that narrative truth? And I want to speak a little bit more about that below when we look at how to address that. Paul in Athens in Acts 17 is a wonderful example of speaking the biblical worldview at cross purposes with the Athenian worldview. Okay. And that's what Richard looked at a little bit last time, and I encourage you to listen to that recording. You can get that from Simon. Tribalism or group thinking untruth is very powerful, even in the scriptures. I remember a chap, Demetrius, around about Acts chapter 19, getting all the craftsmen together and saying, you know, this is Artemis of the Ephesians. Artemis of the Ephesians. She fell from the skies. I mean, they all knew she didn't, right? But their business was at stake. And so tribalism has incredible power to actually disrupt our lives. And many, many, many Christian brothers and churches and pastors have come under the attack, and Christian enterprises, and have closed down and have been vilified and pushed into courts, are sitting in jail across the world because of tribalism or tribal untruth. And then lastly, statism or institutional untruth. And friends, this is going to sound strange to you, but if I had the choice of doing a morning's apologetics on a single issue, it would be this one. I think herein lies a far greater challenge than any of us realize, because it's subtle. It's like grass growing up under our feet. Around about 1980, R.C. Sproul, most of you will know R.C. Sproul. R.C. Sproul went to the airport and collected a man by the name of Francis Schaeffer to take him to a conference. Francis Schaeffer at that point was something of a leading apologist for Christianity in the world, ran L'Abri. And so R.C. Sproul, as they got into the taxi, into the cab, he said to him, Francis, what is our greatest challenge for the Christian church as we look ahead? And Francis Schaeffer said, one word, statism. Now, if you read Schaeffer, you realize how absolutely prescient it is. In other words, statism is this government, the nanny state, that takes care of you in every way, but becomes the totalitarian state. And here in South Africa, if you're not aware, if you're not woke, and I mean that in the right sense of the word, if you're not awake, things are busy happening around us on a weekly basis, going through our court system, that'll cost all of you very dearly in the future if you're not aware of it. So I think this is one of the biggest threats in the world, and you've probably read about it. There are things like cultural Marxism, the Frankfurt School, critical race theory, intersectionality, the tyranny of victimhood, wokeism, etc., and you can ask me about it later. All that this means is that we've really entered into, friends, an age of despair. So all these lies, this spell that has been cast like a blanket, and now I've shown you how wide that blanket is. All of this has cast a spell over humanity. And if you speak to young people, and maybe some of you who are younger this morning, can feel it. You have this sense of a growing depression, of despair. When I talk to my children, they, Dad, there's no future. I'll never own a house. The world's not free. I hear this all the time. If you look at the statistics in terms of depression and suicide, friends, they're off the charts. We live in an age not just of cultural deceit, but long-growing cultural deceit that has led to cultural despair. And so I give you two quotes there. One is a very well-known from Nietzsche's book, ironically titled The Gay Science, that he wrote in 1982, but it's the famous madman parable. And in the end of that parable, you can read it yourself, he says, where is God? God is dead. We have killed him. The grave diggers, we can hear the rustling of the grave diggers coming in to fetch his body. Now that is a prophetic statement, okay? It's not like the graffiti where someone says, God is dead, written by Nietzsche, and then Nietzsche is dead, God. You know, it's not that kind of graffiti. Don't read it in that light. Listen carefully to this very, very, very sensitive man, wicked in his own right, yes, but proclaiming something more than 100 years ago of where culture is going. Listen to Nietzsche. Don't just chuck him in the garbage heap, okay? Listen to him. When we were in Canada, a very famous writer, Douglas Copeland, he coined Generation X. Nobody has not heard of Generation X. He's the one who coined the word. We were in Vancouver at the time, and then he wrote a book called Life After God. And in that book, he tells the story of going on Vancouver Island, absolutely beautiful, and just green, it's a rainforest, and waterfalls everywhere, and getting out of the car and going to stand in a waterfall. Okay, and he's under the waterfall, the water's rushing, and he said, I can now say something with, I've got clarity. Nothing like a bucket of cold water in your face, eh? Like, he's got clarity now. I've got clarity now and I'm going to say something while I'm clear about it, that I know I won't be able to say again. So I'm going to say it now while I'm clear. And he writes these words, my secret is that I need God, that I'm sick and can no longer make it alone. I need God to help me give, because I no longer seem to be capable of giving, to help me be kind, as I no longer seem capable of kindness, to help me love, as I seem beyond being able to love. That really grabs you. And for us who pastored in Canada, we saw the outcome of that. We had almost no children in our church. They were all wayward. The ones who were there had to see a psychologist on a weekly basis. Friends, the world outside these borders is not so great. Okay, very hard on young people, and increasingly so amongst us. Okay, so how do we dispel these lies in 5 minutes? I'll maybe only say 2 key things, but I want to read the quote here, and this is from, how many of you read the Narnia, have read the Narnia tales? Many of you, okay. And in this, and C.S. Lewis is prescient, he is prophetic. And in this book, The Silver Chair, there is a prince who is captivated by a spell, by a serpent who dresses up or transforms into a beautiful lady dressed in green. Ironically, green is the color of envy and ungodliness historically. And these 2 children, alongside a interesting creature who is half frog and half human, set out to find him. And they go, in order to find him, they go underground to an underworld. And then they too are about to come under this spell that this lady is casting. And this is where the narrative picks up. So the prince and the 2 children were standing with their heads hung down, their cheeks flushed, their eyes half closed, their strength had gone from them. The enchantment, the spell, almost complete. But Puddleglum, here's this odd character, he's a marsh wiggle, desperately gathering all his strength, walked over to the fire, and then he did a very brave thing. With his bare foot, he stamped on the fire, grinding a large part of it into the ashes on the flat earth, and 3 things happened at once. And the 3 things that happened are these things. First of all, there was a stench of burnt frog in the air that woke everybody up. It's like, whoa, what's going on here, right? And the second thing is that the lady manifested. Immediately her voice became that demonic voice, that deep demonic voice, and suddenly they could see that she's a snake. And thirdly, they realized that all the truth of Aslan's world, God's world, was far more beautiful and wonderful than the underworld. Now friends, that's exactly where we are. And that's what we need. We need people to put their foot in the fire, as it were. We need to wake up. We need to break the spell. And some of you are going to be the challenger. Some of you, when you challenge evil, friends, it manifests. Let me warn you. For those of you who have not been in that side of Christianity, where Christianity has all been cognitive and nice and social, when Christianity is at the edges and the edges get blurred, when faith is in that domain, when you challenge evil, it manifests. Okay? And some of you will have to be those people who will take on board something of that manifestation. I remember once in a lecture challenging a young man about racism, and this will maybe be a little bit close to the bone, but he said, listen, racism is white prejudice against black. And I said to him, no, it's not. History has proven to us that all racism is prejudice on the basis of ethnicity, whatever those 2 ethnicities might be cognitive or present. And history proves that to us. Okay? And you know what he did? In my theology class, He manifested. He shouted. He screamed. He raved. The lecture had to come to an end. So you see, if we put our foot on an untruth or a cultural lie, there are disastrous consequences. And so I put in the notes for you implausibility structures and defeater beliefs. A defeater belief is basically something that if you believe that, like for example this case that I mentioned, the opposite cannot be true. And when you put a bunch of defeater beliefs together, you get an implausibility structure, and it makes it very hard for Christians to enter into the debate. It's a little bit like Francis Schaeffer unmasking the presupposition. In other words, here's the question of how do I address these things? So I thought hard on the way here, what can I give you as an example? And the rest of the things will be quick. But the example I thought of is that, and I hear this from my students here in the week, that the Bible is a white man's book. So why would the Bible be a white person's book? Okay. Well, because the presupposition is that the Bible came with the missionaries in the 19th century. Okay. So, in other words, if the Bible is a white man's book, that disqualifies people of color to hold to the faith. Okay. And with that, all the debates around did God bring the missionaries, or did missionaries bring God? And the debates around colonialism and post-colonialism and the effects of the things we have in culture basically only spell one thing, that really Christianity is not an option. And yet, look how many of you are here who are from Africa indigenously and who embrace the faith. Okay. But the reality, friends, is that the Bible is not a white man's book, that Christianity did not arrive with the missionaries in the 19th century, that the greatest Christian heroes in Christian history were African, that the Ethiopian eunuch all the way in Acts 18 is one of the first converts to Christ when the gospel goes from Judea to Samaria to the ends of the earth. And then once you've addressed that issue, that fallacy, that lie, and you've given some alternative truths, it is possible, like Lamin Sane, the great African scholar, to say that why should the West actually withhold Christianity from Africa? We want it. We desire it. Okay? Why should God withhold these riches from us? And so I've only sketched, we can talk about that for a long time. But one of the ways then to do is to find these defeater beliefs, these presuppositions, to challenge them, and thereby break down this social imaginary. Okay? Like, for example, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, therefore I have to go through some transgender procedure. Okay? Or to say that people with gender dysphoria, that's a very natural and a good thing, we should encourage it. When all the psychological stats tell us that it's abnormal for a society to go from 2% suicide rate to a 3% suicide rate. If society goes 1% higher in a suicide rate, that is a disaster. We send an investigative team in to find out what's happened, that the suicide rate has gone up 1%. Do you know that the suicide rate amongst people who embrace this is almost 30%? So do you see, we're running into a wall of factuality, into a wall of presuppositions that are just masked over. Friends, we are under a spell, and we need to dispel that. So what is the best way to do that? Well, I give you several ways to do that, but the one I want to highlight in 2 minutes is right desire, beauty, truth, and goodness. And you can go read the quotations for yourself. How do we speak? So beauty, truth, and goodness is the old philosophical triad used by the Greeks to explain something of what the good life might look like. And our approach to apologetics often concentrates on truth. Let me tell the truth to people, then they will do good, and then they will embrace the beautiful. They will have the beautiful. But the culture has been subverted. If you go out with the truth today in your apologetics, friends, nobody listens to you. I can have apologetics. It's amazing that so many of you are here. If I have an apologetics seminar in Stellenbosch, only a few Christians will come. Nobody is interested in apologetics anymore. because the kind of apologetics that they presume it would be is purely intellectual and driven at truth. Of course, it should be truthful. But our culture, says Tim Keller, there's a time in which the heart, the imagination, needs to be employed into leading the mind back to Christ. So if you want to teach a young boy to play soccer, you don't teach him the rules of the game, okay? You take him to a soccer game and you show him and he goes, that is beautiful. So this is basically our approach to ministry, friends, which is why we work with lots of Christian artists. We want to show them how beautiful the faith is, how beautiful this life is, so that the little boy says, I want that. I want to play. And then he can be taught how to play and how to be a good sportsman and what the rules of the game is. And then be able to affirm, what a beautiful game. But looking at the television is not enough. And explaining the rules is not enough. And so literature and the arts is a critical way of leading us into this. So friends, I've got another 2 hours worth of things to say here. So I'm not going to. Turn right to the end to point 4.3. One text before we go. Paul says in 2 Timothy 1, for this reason I also suffer these things, but I am not ashamed, for I know whom I have believed, and am convinced that he is able to guard what I have entrusted to him until that day. He's giving an apologia for his life's enterprise. And note this, he's not saying what I know, what I believed. He says, I know whom I've believed, and is able to, and I know that he is, what I've entrusted to him, he is able to guard until that day. Paul is not ashamed in terms of being quiet. But what he's saying he's not ashamed of is the very nature of the gospel. That the gospel may not deliver the world's goods. That the gospel may lead you down a path of suffering. That the gospel may lead you down a path of shame even. But it is everything. And friends, if you can say that, then you are a biblical apologist. I went 5 minutes over time. Apologies.